He can't remember his own name because of Alzheimer's, but the cat never leaves his side. What it protects brings tears to people's eyes. Kitten, do you? Do you know who I am? Because I'm not sure myself anymore. Mr. Arthur whispered, his eyes lost on the orange cat sitting patiently beside him. The cat only meowed softly, rubbing its head against his trembling hand. Don't miss the touching story between this man with a terrible disease and his beloved cat. Hit the subscribe, like, and listen buttons to discover the heart-wrenching truth behind the special bond between Mr. Arthur and his cat, Leo. The roar of the 18-wheeler's air horn was a physical blow. Arthur Johnson stumbled, his thin hand flying to his chest, the world a dizzying kaleidoscope of flashing lights and shrieking metal. He was on asphalt, hot and gritty beneath his worn slippers. Towering shapes like multicolored cliffs rushed past him, a river of steel and speed. Where was Mary? She wouldn't like him being here. No, Mary was gone, wasn't she? A hollow ache resonated deep within him, a familiar ghost. Meow, murr, row. A streak of orange darted in front of him, a frantic, furry S-curve. Leo, his little friend. The cat's green eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored his own. Leo pushed against his ankles, a desperate, insistent weight, trying to nudge him away from the terrifying noise, away from the edge of this roaring black river. Easy, boy, Arthur mumbled, his voice a dry whisper. He reached down a trembling hand, but Leo dodged instead, batting at his slipper with a soft paw, then darting a few feet in the direction Arthur hadn't come from. Then back again, a low guttural yowl tearing from his small body. It wasn't a normal meow. It was a sound of pure, undiluted panic. Another truck thundered past, its slipstream plucking at Arthur's thin cardigan. He flinched, disoriented. The sun beat down unforgiving. He didn't know this place. The familiar rose bushes of his garden, the chipped paint of his porch swing, all had vanished, replaced by this terrifying, thunderous expanse. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. Mary, he whispered again, a child lost in the dark. Leo's meow became a series of sharp, urgent yelps. The cat ran a little way down the hard shoulder, then back, then towards a small gap in a chain-link fence that Arthur hadn't noticed. He repeated the maneuver, a tiny, determined general trying to direct a confused soldier. A car slowed, its brake lights flaring. Inside, a young woman with wide, horrified eyes was on her phone. She wasn't looking at him, not directly. Her gaze was fixed on the small orange cat, on its frantic, intelligent efforts to herd the old man away from the blur of the interstate. Leo, sensing a potential ally, or perhaps just a change in the threatening landscape, turned towards the slowing car and let out a long, piercing cry, a sound that seemed to carry all the fear and desperation of the lost old man he so clearly adored. The car door opened. Just 5 years earlier, Arthur Johnson had been the cornerstone of his quiet life in Oak Haven, Illinois. A retired history teacher, he was known for his gentle demeanor, his encyclopedic knowledge of the town's past, and the prize-winning roses he cultivated with a tenderness usually reserved for his late wife, Mary. Mary had been gone for a decade, a loss that had muted the colors of his world but hadn't extinguished his quiet warmth. He still volunteered at the local library, still took his daily walks, a familiar figure with a kind word for everyone. His daughter Sarah, a pragmatic but loving single mother working as a nurse, lived a town over. She'd begun to notice the small things first, the forgotten appointments, the repeated anecdotes, the way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, a look of bewildered frustration clouding his usually bright blue eyes. Then came the day he'd gotten lost on his familiar walk home from the library, found hours later by a concerned neighbor, sitting on a park bench, unable to recall his own address. The diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease had been a heavy blow, a thief arriving to steal not possessions, but Arthur himself, piece by precious piece. Leo had entered Arthur's life 3 years before the diagnosis, a tiny rain-soaked ball of orange fur Arthur had found huddled under a dumpster behind the local diner during a thunderstorm. He was no bigger than Arthur's hand, his mews barely audible. Arthur had scooped him up, tucked him inside his coat, and taken him home. A week later, just as the kitten, now named Leo, for his surprisingly brave little spirit, was starting to explore with newfound confidence, tragedy nearly struck. Leo, spooked by a passing car, had darted into the street. Arthur, without a thought for his own 70-odd years, had lunged after him, snatching him from the path of an oncoming pickup truck with inches to spare. He'd fallen heavily, scraping his hands and knees, but Leo was safe, nestled against his chest, purring like a tiny motor, despite the scare. That day, an unbreakable bond had been forged, a silent promise of devotion from the little creature whose life he had saved. As Arthur's memory began to fray more noticeably, a moment of poignant foresight struck him. He was sitting on his porch, Leo curled on his lap, the cat's rhythmic purr a comforting thrum against his palm. "What if I forget everything, Leo?" he'd murmured, stroking the soft fur. "What if I forget you? Forget my way home?" The fear was a cold knot in his stomach. That week, with Sarah's help, he'd fashioned a special collar for Leo. It was a simple leather band, but attached to it was a small screw-top brass capsule. Inside, on a tightly rolled piece of paper, Sarah had carefully printed, "My name is Arthur Johnson. I have Alzheimer's. If I am lost, please call my daughter Sarah," followed by her phone number and Arthur's address. "There," Arthur had said, his voice thick with emotion as he fastened the collar around Leo's neck. "Maybe you can tell them who I am, boy, when I can't." The inciting incident came on a crisp October afternoon. Sarah had been at work, and Arthur, feeling relatively lucid that morning, had decided to walk to the park. He'd told his part-time caregiver he'd be back in an hour. 3 hours later, the caregiver called Sarah in a panic. Arthur was missing. The search had been frantic. The police were called. Neighbors fanned out. It was dusk when young Timmy Evans, a boy who often saw Arthur and Leo on their walks, spotted Leo sitting patiently by the entrance to the old disused railway line on the outskirts of town. The cat was meowing insistently, looking towards the overgrown tracks. Timmy, remembering his mother mentioned the old man's forgetfulness, called his dad, who found Arthur a quarter-mile down the tracks, confused, cold, but unharmed, Leo huddled faithfully at his feet. The brass capsule on Leo's collar was unopened. No one had known to look. That night, Sarah sat by her father's bedside watching him sleep. The relief was immense, but so was the fear. "We were lucky today, Dad," she whispered, tears in her eyes. The thought of a nursing home, a place Arthur had always said he'd rather die than enter, loomed larger and more inevitable in her mind. How could she keep him safe? He wouldn't even know to show someone Leo's collar. Yet the image of Leo steadfastly waiting sparked a tiny, desperate idea. What if people did know about the collar? What if Leo could truly be his lifeline? The following weeks were a tightrope walk for Sarah. She juggled her nursing shifts, her son and her father's increasingly erratic needs. Arthur had good days where he'd reminisce about teaching or share a joke, his old sparkle briefly returning. On those days, he'd talk to Leo with a poignant clarity. "You're a good friend, Leo," he'd say, scratching the cat's chin. "Don't know what I'd do without you." But the bad days were more frequent, filled with confusion, agitation, and the unnerving blankness in his eyes when he looked at Sarah as if she were a stranger. The fear of him wandering off again was a constant, gnawing anxiety. The thought of a care facility felt like a betrayal, yet the responsibility was overwhelming. Leo, meanwhile, seemed to acutely sense the shift in his beloved human. His attentiveness sharpened. He'd position himself by the door when Arthur seemed restless, a furry orange sentinel. If Arthur managed to slip out, Leo was always with him, no longer just a companion, but a gentle, persistent guide. He'd weave in front of Arthur, nudging him towards familiar routes, his meows soft but insistent. If Arthur paused, disoriented, Leo would sit patiently at his feet, the brass capsule on his collar glinting faintly. Some in the small town of Oak Haven began to notice. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the Main Street bakery, once saw Arthur standing confusedly at the intersection. "He was about to walk into traffic, dear," she told Sarah later. "And that little cat of his, bless his heart, ran right in front of him, meowing like mad, then rubbed against his legs until he stopped. Smartest animal I ever did see." However, not everyone was so understanding. Mr. Grumbles, the perpetually sour owner of Grumbles' Hardware, often shooed Leo away if the cat ventured near his storefront while trailing Arthur. "Get that flea bag out of here, Johnson," he'd call out, even if Arthur was too lost in his own world to register the complaint. Cats don't belong in shops. Complication 1, the annual Oak Haven Fall Festival, brought a fresh wave of anxiety for Sarah. She'd hoped to keep Arthur home, but he'd been surprisingly insistent, a flicker of his old enthusiasm for the town event lighting his eyes. Reluctantly, she'd agreed, thinking a short supervised visit would be manageable. But the crowds, the music from the brass band, and the cacophony of the midway games quickly overwhelmed Arthur. He became agitated, his grip tightening on Sarah's arm. In a moment, when Sarah was distracted by her son needing a restroom, Arthur, bewildered by the noise, slipped away into the throng. Panic seized Sarah. Leo, who had been weaving through their legs, immediately shot after Arthur. Sarah, pushing through the crowd, followed the flash of orange. She found Arthur by the chaotic petting zoo, staring blankly at a bleating goat. Leo was frantically trying to get his attention, then seeing that Fail began to tug at the trouser leg of a nearby festival volunteer, a teenager busy handing out balloons. The boy, annoyed, tried to shake Leo off. "Hey, Skay," he began, then saw Leo's desperate gaze fixed on Arthur, and then up at him, a distinct, intelligent plea in the cat's eyes. The boy paused, a flicker of understanding. "Is this your grandpa, ma'am?" he asked as Sarah rushed up. Complication 2. A new family. The Parkers moved in next door to Arthur. Mrs. Parker, a woman who prided herself on neighborhood orderliness, quickly took issue with Arthur's unsupervised walks, and particularly with Leo. "It's not safe, Sarah," she'd said, her tone sharp with disapproval. "For your father or for us. And that cat. Well, it's hardly hygienic. Is it always underfoot? What if it trips him?" She'd even hinted at calling Adult Protective Services if something wasn't done. The pressure mounted on Sarah. She tried to explain about Leo's collar, showing Mrs. Parker the capsule. "It's got all his information," Sarah explained, her voice pleading. Mrs. Parker had merely sniffed. A cat. Dear really, complication. 3. One misty morning, as Arthur and Leo were on their usual short loop around the block, a boisterous Labrador off-leash and over-friendly bounded towards them. Leo, ever protective, arched his back and hissed, placing himself between Arthur and the dog. The Labrador, meaning no harm but clumsy in its excitement, bowled Leo over. Arthur cried out in distress, "Leo, bad dog!" The dog's owner quickly leashed his pet, full of apologies. But Leo limped for the rest of the day, a small, painful reminder of his vulnerability. Sarah's heart ached. How much could she realistically rely on a small cat? However devoted, desperate Sarah began to consciously try and teach people about Leo. She'd point out the collar to Mrs. Henderson. "If Dad ever seems really lost and Leo's trying to get your attention, please just look at his collar." Mrs. Henderson, already a convert, promised she would. But convincing others like Mr. Grumbles or the formidable Mrs. Parker felt like an uphill battle. The weight of her father's safety, his happiness, and the ever-present threat of having to make that decision about a care home pressed down on her relentlessly. Leo, oblivious to the human complexities but keenly aware of his master's needs, simply continued his steadfast vigil, a small orange beacon of loyalty in the encroaching fog of Arthur's mind. The late autumn storm hit Oak Haven with unexpected ferocity. What began as a drizzle at lunchtime escalated into a blinding downpour by mid-afternoon, the wind howling like a banshee, rattling windows and tearing bright leaves from the maples. Sarah was caught at the hospital, a pileup on the interstate having flooded the ER. Arthur's caregiver, a kind but elderly woman named Doris, was due to leave at 3. She called Sarah worried. "Arthur's very agitated with the storm, dear. Keeps pacing to the window. I'll stay a bit longer, but you know my bus." By the time Sarah managed to get away, it was nearly 5, the sky a bruised purple. She drove home through sheets of rain, her heart pounding with a familiar dread. Doris's car was gone. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Dad," she called, her voice tight. "Leo?" No answer. A quick search confirmed her worst fears. Arthur's worn raincoat and boots were gone. Leo was nowhere to be seen. He'd wandered off into the teeth of the storm. This time, it felt different, more dangerous. The familiar streets would be slick and treacherous, visibility near zero. He could have fallen. He could be anywhere. Sarah called the police, then started dialing neighbors, her hands shaking. Arthur, meanwhile, was lost in a terrifying wind-swept world. The storm had transformed his familiar neighborhood into a hostile landscape. Rain lashed his face, and the wind tugged at him like an angry hand. He didn't know where he was going, only that he felt a desperate need to be somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere that felt like home. But home was an elusive concept, a word without a clear image attached. Leo was a miserable, soaked presence at his heels, his meows nearly swallowed by the gale. The cat repeatedly tried to steer him, to push him towards the shelter of porches or awnings, but Arthur, caught in the grip of a profound disorientation, barely registered the cat's efforts. He stumbled on, driven by an internal compass gone haywire, heading towards the old, sparsely populated Willow Creek area, a place of dense woods and a fast-flowing, swollen creek. Leo knew this was bad. The creek was a torrent, its banks slippery and undermined. His master was shivering, muttering incoherently and getting dangerously close to the churning water. The cat tried all his usual tactics, nudging, meowing, even a gentle nip at Arthur's ankle. Nothing worked. Arthur was beyond his reach. In a moment of desperate, almost human calculation, Leo made a decision. He couldn't leave Arthur, not for long, but he couldn't save him alone out here. He gave Arthur one last frantic rub against his legs, then turned and bolted, a streak of wet orange disappearing into the storm-lashed gloom back the way they had come. He ran with a desperate urgency he'd never known, his small paws splashing through puddles, the wind trying to tear him from his path. He didn't head for Arthur's house. He headed for Grumbles' hardware. It was closer than the bakery, and despite Mr. Grumbles' usual hostility, the shop was often lit late. He arrived, a sodden, half-drowned creature, and flung himself at the glass door, meowing with a sound so raw, so filled with terror and urgency, it was barely recognizable as a cat's cry. Mr. Grumbles was inside cashing up. He looked up annoyed. What in the blazes? He saw the drenched cat. Johnson's flea bag, get out! But Leo didn't back down. He clawed at the door, his cries escalating. Then he did something he'd never done before. He backed away from the door, ran a few paces towards the street, looked back at Mr. Grumbles with piercing intensity, and meowed again. A clear, unmistakable summons. Then he repeated it. Mr. Grumbles paused, his irritation giving way to a strange unease. He'd seen that cat with Johnson every day for years. He knew Johnson was off. The sheer intelligent desperation in the animal's eyes was unnerving. He looked closer, noticing the glint of the brass capsule on Leo's collar, something he'd never paid attention to before. Slowly, he walked to the door and opened it. All right. What's got your fur in a twist? Leo didn't try to enter. He immediately turned and ran a short way down the street towards Willow Creek, then stopped, looking back, his meow insistent. A light seemed to dawn in Mr. Grumbles' grumpy eyes. Johnson, he muttered. He's out in this. He grabbed his coat and phone, dialing Sarah's number, which he knew by heart from her occasional orders for Arthur's garden. Sarah, it's Al Grumbles. Your cat's here acting like a lunatic. I think your dad's out towards the creek. Together, led by frantic but determined Leo Sarah, who arrived minutes later, Mr. Grumbles and two police officers they encountered battled their way towards Willow Creek. Leo, despite his exhaustion, never faltered, leading them through the woods with uncanny accuracy. They found Arthur huddled beneath a thicket of sodden bushes near the dangerously eroded creek bank, shivering violently, confused but alive. Leo immediately darted to his side, licking his cold hand. As they helped Arthur up, Mr. Grumbles, his usual scowl replaced by a look of grudging awe, reached down and gently touched Leo's wet head. That cat, he said to Sarah, his voice gruff with emotion. He's something else. He really is. The terror of that night was a turning point. The story of Leo's heroism, especially his desperate appeal to Mr. Grumbles, spread through Oak Haven. People who had dismissed Leo as just a cat began to see him differently. For Sarah, the incident solidified a new resolve. The idea of a nursing home receded. If the community could understand if they could work with Leo, perhaps her father could stay in his beloved home. She was no longer just reacting to the disease. She became proactive, determined to make Leo's devotion a recognized part of her father's safety net. In the aftermath of the storm and Arthur's dramatic rescue, Sarah felt a surge of purpose. Armed with Mr. Grumble's newfound respect for Leo, a respect that surprisingly he began to voice to his customers, Sarah launched a small initiative. She designed simple, laminated cards. On one side was a charming photo of Leo looking alert and intelligent. On the other, a brief explanation: "This is Leo. He is Arthur Johnson's companion and helper. Mr. Johnson has Alzheimer's and may get lost. If Leo is trying to get your attention, or if Mr. Johnson seems confused, please check the brass capsule on Leo's collar for contact information or call Sarah Johnson directly at her number. Thank you for being part of Oak Haven's caring community." She called it Leo's Watch. With a mix of trepidation and hope, she, along with a now surprisingly enthusiastic Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, distributed the cards to local businesses, the library, the post office, and to neighbors, including a slightly sheepish Mrs. Parker, who accepted one with a non-committal sniff. The change was gradual, but noticeable. A few days later, the owner of the Oak Haven diner called Sarah. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Gary from the diner. Your dad's here seems a bit mixed up. That orange cat of his, Leo. Well, he came right up to the counter and started meowing at me, then nudged his head towards your dad. Just like that card said, 'Don't you worry, he's safe here with a cup of tea.'" Relief washed over Sarah. It was working. There were other small victories. Teenagers who once might have ignored a wandering old man now recognized Leo and knew what to do. Shopkeepers kept an eye out. Oak Haven, a town already possessing a strong sense of community, began to embrace its newest, furriest neighborhood watch member. Leo, for his part, seemed to take his increased responsibility in stride, his intelligent green eyes missing nothing. However, the pressure from official channels hadn't entirely vanished. Mrs. Parker, though less openly critical, had evidently shared her earlier concerns with someone. A polite but firm letter arrived from County Adult Protective Services acknowledging Mr. Johnson's situation and requesting an in-home assessment. The letter mentioned reports of unsupervised wandering and reliance on unconventional support methods. The threat of intervention, of having the decision taken out of her hands, became a quiet ticking clock for Sarah. If there was another serious incident, Arthur's condition, as Alzheimer's inexorably does, continued its slow decline. His lucid moments became rarer, fleeting glimpses of the man he once was. He increasingly lived in a world of shadows and fragmented memories, his conversations often a jumble of past and present. "Mary, is that you?" he'd ask Sarah, his eyes unfocused. "Time for class mustn't be late." Through it all, Leo was his constant. Arthur would often sit for hours simply stroking Leo's fur, the rhythmic purr, a soothing anchor in his turbulent mental sea. "You still here, fella?" he'd murmur, a flicker of recognition in his voice. "Good boy, Leo. Good boy." The story of Leo's dedication, particularly his role in the storm rescue, eventually reached the ears of Emily Carter, a young, ambitious reporter for the Oak Haven Chronicle. She saw a heartwarming human interest piece, a welcome antidote to the usual diet of town council disputes and minor local crimes. Sarah was hesitant at first, fearing sensationalism or unwanted scrutiny. But Emily seemed genuine, and Sarah reasoned that a positive story might further solidify community support and perhaps even subtly counter the concerns raised by APS. "It's not just a cute cat story," Sarah told her. "It's about how a community and an animal's incredible loyalty can help someone live with dignity. The interview took place in Arthur's small, sun-filled living room. Arthur was having a relatively good day, though he mostly just smiled vaguely and petted Leo, who lay draped across his lap. Sarah did most of the talking, explaining the Leo's Watch initiative and recounting some of Leo's more remarkable interventions. Emily was captivated, her pen flying across her notepad. Then came the setback, the dark night of the soul for Sarah. It happened a few days after the interview, just as a town-wide search for a different missing elderly person, a woman with dementia from a neighboring community who had wandered from her daughter's care, was dominating local news and heightening Oak Haven's collective anxiety about its vulnerable seniors. Arthur had been pottering in his small fenced backyard with Leo. Sarah was inside on a work call. When she went to check on him, Arthur was calmly deadheading roses, but Leo was at the back fence engrossed in a tense standoff with a large raccoon. Sarah shooed the raccoon away. It was only later that evening, when she was settling Arthur for bed, that she noticed it. Leo's collar was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. They searched the backyard with flashlights, every bush, every corner. Nothing. Leo must have snagged it on a branch or during the scuffle with the raccoon. It could be anywhere. Without that collar, Leo's primary tool, the very thing that made Leo's watch functional, was gone. All the progress, all the fragile security they had built felt suddenly and terrifyingly vulnerable. If Arthur wandered now, the thought was unbearable. The timing with the other missing person case, so prominent, felt like a cruel twist of fate. Oak Haven's Founders Day Parade was the town's biggest event of the year. Main Street throbbed with marching bands, vintage cars, and cheering crowds. Sarah had planned to keep Arthur home, especially with Leo's collar still missing, but Arthur, perhaps stirred by some deep, decades-old memory of past parades, had been unusually agitated, his gaze repeatedly drawn to the distant sounds of music and festivity. Reluctantly hoping the familiar atmosphere might prove a positive stimulant, Sarah had walked him to a quieter spot near the end of the parade route, Leo a less conspicuous but still watchful presence at their feet. Emily Carter, the reporter, was also there, notebook in hand, covering the parade, but also keeping an eye out for any follow-up color for her Hero Cat of Oak Haven story. The sudden blare of a fire truck siren joining the parade unexpectedly shattered Arthur's fragile calm. He flinched violently, his eyes wide with a nameless terror. Before Sarah could react, he wrenched his hand from hers and bolted not towards home, but away from the noise, plunging into a narrow alleyway between two old storefronts. "Dad!" Sarah cried, pushing past startled onlookers. Arthur emerged from the alley into a quieter, almost deserted service road that ran behind Main Street, bordering the steep wooded embankment leading down to the Oak Haven River. He was moving with a surprising, fear-fueled speed. Leo, a flash of orange, was right behind him, meowing desperately. By the time Sarah reached the service road, Arthur was already halfway down its length, heading towards the old, partially dilapidated bandstand park that overlooked a treacherous, rocky section of the river. The area was known for its crumbling retaining walls and slippery paths. Leo knew this was a crisis far beyond a simple misdirection. His master was heading for real danger, and the familiar weight of the brass capsule was absent from his neck. He couldn't rely on strangers reading instructions. He had to use everything he knew, every bit of intelligence and learned behavior. Arthur reached the edge of the bandstand park, teetering precariously close to a section where the old stone wall had given way, leaving a sheer drop to the fast-flowing river below. He was muttering, "Mary, the boat, nearly there." Leo, seeing the imminent peril, didn't hesitate. He launched himself not at Arthur, but back towards the direction of the parade, towards where he'd last seen Sarah and the other familiar faces. He spotted a small knot of people at the alley's entrance. Sarah, her face a mask of terror, and with her Mr. Grumbles, who joined her frantic search along with Emily Carter. Leo ran towards them, but didn't just meow. He let out a series of sharp, almost barking yelps, then grabbed the cuff of Mr. Grumbles' trousers in his teeth, the same man who had once called him a flea bag, tugging with surprising strength. He released it, ran 10 feet toward the bandstand park, then looked back, his green eyes blazing with an undeniable, desperate intelligence. He repeated the tug, the run, the look. "My God," breathed Emily Carter, her journalistic instincts momentarily forgotten. Mr. Grumbles, his face pale but resolute, didn't need convincing. "He's found him," he yelled, his voice cutting through the distant parade noise. "I know that look. He's telling us Arthur's in trouble. Follow Leo." They sprinted after the small orange cat. Leo didn't slow, leading them directly through the overgrown park to the crumbling precipice. Arthur was standing mere inches from the edge, swaying slightly oblivious. Just as he took another unsteady step, Mr. Grumbles, with a desperate lunge, caught his arm, pulling him back to safety. Sarah collapsed against the park bench, sobbing with relief. Leo, panting, pressed himself against Arthur's legs, looking up at the saved man, then at the rescuers, his mission accomplished. Emily Carter, tears streaming down her own face, captured the raw, powerful moment with her camera. The "what it protects" was blindingly clear, a life held precious by a tiny, determined animal. The immediate aftermath was a blur of relief and quiet awe. Arthur, though confused by the commotion, was unharmed, bundled into a warm blanket Sarah had grabbed. The story Emily Carter wrote, accompanied by the striking photo of Leo looking up at a shaken Arthur by the riverbank, wasn't just a local feature. It was picked up by regional news outlets. "Oak Haven's guardian angel cat saves owner again," ran one headline. The town, already fond of Leo, now regarded him as a bona fide hero. Even Mrs. Parker was seen leaving a small dish of tuna on her porch for him the next day. The formal inquiry from Adult Protective Services quietly concluded with a commendation for the community's innovative support system. A new collar was swiftly made for Leo, this one, a sturdy custom-designed piece with a more secure engraved metal tag containing all of Arthur's information. Donations poured in unsolicited, which Sarah used to formalize Leo's watch, creating a small fund for printing more cards and even a GPS tracker for Leo's new collar, just in case. The initiative became a model, with other small towns reaching out to learn how Oak Haven was supporting its vulnerable residents with the help of a very special feline. Arthur Johnson continued to live in his familiar home, surrounded by his roses and the unwavering presence of his ginger cat. His memory of names, faces, even his own, grew dimmer with each passing season. There were days he didn't seem to recognize Sarah, moments when the world was a frightening alien landscape. But through it all, his hand would instinctively find Leo's soft fur. "Good cat," he would murmur, a rare flicker of something akin to recognition, or perhaps just deep comfort in his faded blue eyes. "Good, Leo." And Leo the cat, who remembered the man who had saved him, remained steadfast. He was more than a pet, more than a helper. He was a living, purring embodiment of loyalty and love, a silent guardian who protected not just Arthur's physical safety, but the last precious embers of his connection to the world, his dignity, and the beautiful fading memory of the kind man he had once been. As they took their slow, shuffling walks through Oak Haven, townsfolk would smile a bittersweet ache in their hearts. The sight of the old man lost in the fog of his mind, yet so faithfully attended by his little orange shadow, brought tears to their eyes. Tears for the cruelty of Alzheimer's, yes, but also tears for the profound, unbreakable bond that proved some things like true devotion could shine brightly even in the deepest twilight.